The leather bit between Karen Long's teeth had long since turned slick with blood. Her wrists, bound to the wooden post in the center of Millbrook's town square, had gone numb an hour ago, but the fire across her back blazed with each fresh strike of Michael Brooks's whip. The crowd pressed closer with every crack of leather against flesh, their faces twisted with a hunger that made her stomach turn more than the pain itself. 23, called out Matthew Stewart, the town's self-appointed moral authority, his voice carrying over the jeers and whispers. 7 more for the adulteress. Karen's vision blurred as she fought to stay conscious. The rough wooden post scraped against her cheek as her body sagged forward. Through the haze of agony, she caught glimpses of familiar faces in the crowd. Helen Williams clutched her shawl tighter, her eyes wide with horrified fascination. Sarah Harris whispered something to her husband, Robert Ross, who nodded grimly. These were people she had known for years, people who had shared meals at her table when her husband Thomas was alive, people who had called her friend. The whip sang through the air again, and Karen bit down harder on the leather, tasting copper. 24. Her mind drifted to Thomas, dead these 6 months from the fever that swept through town last winter. If he could see her now, bound and bleeding for a crime she never committed, what would he think? Would he believe Alexander Roberts' lies about finding her in his barn? Would he join this mob, or would he stand between them and his wife? The Lord sees all sins, Michael Brooks declared, raising the whip again. His face gleamed with sweat despite the cool October morning. And all sins must be paid for in blood. Karen closed her eyes and tried to find that place in her mind where the pain couldn't reach. She thought of the mountains that ring their valley, of the tall pines that whispered secrets to the wind. Somewhere up there, beyond the reach of men like Brooks and Stewart, there had to be peace. There had to be mercy. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The 25th lash never came. A murmur rippled through the crowd, starting at the back and spreading forward like water through dry earth. Karen forced her eyes open and saw people turning, craning their necks to see something beyond her field of vision. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Who is that? Where did he come from? Look at the size of him. Michael Brooks lowered his whip, his brow furrowed with confusion. Matthew Stewart stepped forward, shading his eyes against the morning sun. What's the meaning of this interruption? We have the Lord's work to finish here. The crowd parted like wheat before a scythe, and through the gap walked a man unlike any Karen had ever seen. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown ox. His hair, black as a moonless night, hung past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskins that had seen hard use, and a long rifle rested across his back. But it was his eyes that made Karen's breath catch in her throat. They were the color of winter ice, pale and piercing. And they seemed to see everything at once. The mountain man, for that's what he had to be, moved through the crowd without a word. People stumbled over themselves to get out of his way. He walked with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and sure. When he reached the edge of the circle that had formed around the whipping post, he stopped and surveyed the scene with those unsettling eyes. "This is none of your concern, stranger," Matthew Stewart said, though his voice lacked its earlier authority. "This woman has been judged by the good people of Millbrook and found wanting. She must pay for her sins." The mountain man's gaze moved from Stewart to Brooks to the crowd, and finally settled on Karen. She felt those ice-blue eyes studying her face, her wounds, her bonds. There was something in that look that made her feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her torn dress or bleeding back. It was as if he could see straight through to her soul and was weighing what he found there. "What sins?" The mountain man's voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. Alexander Roberts pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He was a prosperous man, owner of the largest farm in the valley, and he carried himself with the confidence that came from never having his word questioned. "I found her in my barn 3 nights past, stranger. Found her with my hired hand, engaging in acts that would make the angels weep. She's a married woman, or was before her husband died. Such behavior cannot be tolerated in a God-fearing community." Karen wanted to scream, to tell them all that Roberts was lying, that she had never set foot in his barn, that she had been home that night tending to her sick cow. But the leather bit made speech impossible. And even if she could speak, who would believe her word against that of Alexander Roberts? The mountain man listened to Roberts' accusation without expression. When the farmer finished speaking, the silence stretched long enough for Karen to hear the whistle of wind through the nearby trees. Finally, the mountain man spoke again. "You saw this yourself?" "With my own eyes," Roberts had declared, "as God is my witness." "And where is this hired hand now?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Roberts' face. He fled in the night, guilty conscience, no doubt. Convenient. The single word hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Robert's face reddened. "Are you calling me a liar, stranger?" The mountain man didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the whipping post and knelt beside Karen. Up close, she could see scars crisscrossing his hands and forearms, evidence of a life lived hard in unforgiving country. He reached out slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal, and gently lifted her chin so he could look into her eyes. "Did you do what they say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Karen shook her head as much as the bonds would allow. The mountain man studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once as if satisfied by what he saw there. "I believe you." He stood and turned back to the crowd. Matthew Stewart stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Now see here, stranger, you have no authority in this town. We have followed proper procedure. The woman was accused by a reliable witness, and the evidence of her guilt is clear. The law demands justice." "Whose law?" the mountain man asked. "God's law, the law of decent folk everywhere. I've traveled from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande," the mountain man said, his voice carrying easily across the square. "I've seen what decent folk do in the name of their laws. I've seen innocent people hanged, shot, burned, and whipped by mobs who were so certain of their righteousness that they never bothered to ask if they might be wrong." Michael Brooks raised his whip. "We've heard enough of your blasphemy, stranger. Stand aside, or you'll find yourself sharing her punishment." The mountain man's hand moved to the knife at his belt, a blade nearly as long as Karen's forearm. "I'd like to see you treat them." The crowd stirred uneasily. These were farmers and shopkeepers, not fighters. They were brave enough when facing a bound woman, but the mountain man radiated a quiet menace that made even the boldest among them reconsider their position. "There's 30 of us, and one of you," Alexander Robert called out, though he made no move to advance. 30 sheep and 1 wolf, the mountain man replied. "I like those odds." Karen watched the standoff with growing amazement. This stranger, this man she had never seen before, was willing to face down an entire town for her sake. Wait, what did he gain from defending a woman he didn't even know? The mountain man knelt beside her again and began working at the ropes that bound her wrists. His fingers were surprisingly gentle for their size, and he took care not to cause her additional pain as he freed her hands. When the bonds fell away, Karen's arms dropped to her sides like dead weight. She tried to flex her fingers, but they wouldn't obey her commands. "Easy," the mountain man murmured. "The feeling will come back slowly." He removed the leather bit from her mouth, and Karen worked her jaw, trying to restore circulation to her face. When she finally found her voice, it came out as barely more than a croak. "Thank you." The mountain man nodded and shrugged out of his buckskin jacket. He draped it around Karen's shoulders, covering her torn dress and the worst of her wounds. The jacket was warm from his body heat and smelled of pine smoke and leather. "Can you stand?" he asked. Karen tried to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her. The mountain man caught her before she could fall, his arms strong and steady. He lifted her as easily as he might lift a child, cradling her against his chest. "This is intolerable," Matthew Stewart declared. "You cannot simply walk into our town and interfere with our justice. That woman is a convicted adulteress. She must pay for her crimes." The mountain man looked at Stewart with something approaching contempt. "Your justice? You tied a woman to a post and whipped her bloody based on the word of one man. You didn't investigate his claims. You didn't seek corroborating evidence. You didn't even give her a chance to defend herself." That's not justice, that's a lynching. She's guilty, Alexander Roberts insisted. I saw what I saw. Did you? The mountain man's voice was deadly quiet. Or did you see what you wanted to see? What you needed to see to justify what you wanted to do to her? Roberts's face went pale. How dare you? I dare because I've seen men like you before, the mountain man interrupted. Men who use their position in the community to prey on the vulnerable. Men who hide their sins behind righteous words and moral posturing. Tell me, Roberts, what did you really want from this woman? What did she refuse to give you? The crowd began to murmur among themselves. Karen saw doubt creeping into some faces, questions that hadn't been there before. Helen Williams was frowning now, her gaze moving between Roberts and the mountain man. Sarah Harris whispered urgently to her husband, who shook his head grimly. You're talking nonsense, Roberts blustered, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Am I, William? Then you won't mind if I take a closer look at your barn. I'm good at reading sign, Roberts. Very good. If this woman was really there 3 nights ago, there'll be evidence. Footprints, disturbed hay, maybe even some of her clothing or hair. But if she wasn't there, the mountain man let the implication hang in the air. Roberts took a step backward. You have no right. I have every right to seek the truth, unless you have something to hide. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Karen's labored breathing. She felt dizzy and weak, but she forced herself to stay conscious. This man had risked everything to save her. The least she could do was witness whatever came next. Matthew Stewart looked around at the crowd, seeing the doubt in their faces, the questions in their eyes. His authority was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Even if there are questions about this particular accusation, the woman is still suspect. She's been seen talking to men, accepting their help with her farm work. A widow should maintain proper distance from... A widow should be helped by her community, the mountain man cut him off. She should be protected and supported, not persecuted for trying to survive. What kind of Christians are you? Robert Ross stepped forward from the crowd. He was a quiet man, a blacksmith who rarely spoke in public. But when he did, people listened. Raymond Price, he said, addressing the mountain man. That's your name, isn't it? I heard tell of you from travelers passing through. They say you're a fair man, a man who keeps his word. So he had a name, Raymond Price. Karen filed it away, this first concrete detail about the man who had saved her life. Raymond nodded slowly. I try to be. Then give us your word, Ross continued. If you find evidence that this woman was in Roberts's barn, you'll bring her back to face justice. But if you find she was never there, then Roberts answers for bearing false witness, Raymond finished, and for whatever he really did that night. Alexander Roberts's face had gone from pale to ashen. This is ridiculous. I won't stand for... You'll stand for whatever the truth reveals, Raymond said. His voice carried a note of finality that silenced any further protest. The crowd was beginning to disperse, the bloodlust that had brought them together fading in the face of uncertainty. Some still glared at Karen with suspicion, but others looked ashamed, as if they were just now realizing what they had been party to. Raymond adjusted his hold on Karen, preparing to carry her away from this place of pain and judgment. But as he turned to leave, Matthew Stewart called out one last time. Where will you take her? If she's innocent, she can return to her home. But if she's guilty, I'll deal with it, Raymond replied. But she won't be, because I know a liar when I see one, and Roberts has been lying since the moment I arrived. As Raymond carried Karen through the thinning crowd, she caught sight of Alexander Roberts' face one final time. The expression she saw there made her blood run cold. It wasn't shame or embarrassment or even anger. It was calculation. The look of a man whose first plan had failed but who was already working on his second. He won't give up, she whispered to Raymond, her voice barely audible. Raymond's arms tightened around her slightly. I know, but that's a problem for later. Right now, we need to get you somewhere safe where those wounds can be properly tended. Karen closed her eyes and let herself be carried away from the town square, away from the jeering faces and pointing fingers, away from the post where she had nearly died for a crime she didn't commit. But even as relief flooded through her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and mysterious, promising sanctuary but also isolation. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, placing her life in the hands of a stranger who had appeared like something out of legend. Raymond Price, the mountain man who had walked into Millbrook and turned her world upside down with nothing more than his presence and his unwavering belief in her innocence. As they reached the edge of town, Karen heard the sound of horses behind them. She craned her neck to look back and saw Alexander Roberts mounting his stallion, his face set with grim determination. He wasn't alone. Michael Brooks was with him, along with two other men she didn't recognize. "Raymond," she whispered urgently. He had already seen them. His pace quickened, but he was on foot and carrying an injured woman. The mounted men would catch up to them long before they reached the safety of the mountains. "Hold on," Raymond said. "Why are you doing?" His voice calm despite their desperate situation. "This isn't over yet." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the surrounding hills like thunder before a storm. Karen felt Raymond's muscles tense beneath her as he prepared for whatever was coming. Behind them, Alexander Roberts and his companions were gaining ground with every passing second. The chase had begun, and Karen Long found herself caught between the man who had saved her and the men who wanted to see her dead. In the distance, the mountains waited, silent and impassive, offering sanctuary to those strong enough to reach them and claim it. But first, they would have to survive what was coming behind them. The hoofbeats thundered closer, each strike against the hard-packed earth marking another second stolen from their escape. Raymond's breathing remained steady despite the weight in his arms and the urgency of their flight. But Karen could feel the tension coiling through his muscles like a spring wound too tight. Behind them, Alexander Roberts' voice cut through the morning air, sharp with authority and false righteousness. "Price, stop where you are. You're harboring a convicted criminal." Raymond didn't slow his pace, but Karen felt his grip shift slightly, positioning her weight more securely against his chest. His pale eyes swept the landscape ahead, calculating distances and possibilities with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years reading terrain for survival. The nearest cover lay a quarter-mile ahead, where a stand of oak trees marked the beginning of the foothills. But they would never make it on foot before the mounted men overtook them. "There," Raymond murmured, nodding toward a rocky outcropping that jutted from the hillside like a broken tooth. "We can make our stand there." Karen's heart hammered against her ribs. She had seen what men like Roberts and Brooks were capable of when their blood was up. The memory of the whip's bite across her back was still fresh, the wounds beneath Raymond's jacket still seeping. "They'll kill you for helping me." "They can try." The simple confidence in those three words should have been reassuring, but Karen had lived in Millbrook long enough to know that righteousness and numbers often trumped skill and courage. Roberts had brought 3 men with him, all armed, all convinced they were doing God's work by hunting down a fallen woman and her protector. Raymond reached the outcropping just as the first horse crested the small rise behind them. He set Karen down gently behind a boulder that would shield her from rifle fire, then unslung the long gun from his back with fluid efficiency. The weapon was unlike anything Karen had seen before, longer than the standard rifles carried by the townsmen, with intricate metalwork along the barrel that spoke of craftsmanship and care. "Stay low," he told her, checking the rifle's priming with practiced movements. "No matter what happens, don't show yourself." Alexander Roberts reined in his stallion 50 yards away, his 3 companions fanning out to either side in a rough semicircle. Michael Brooks held his whip coiled in one hand, the leather dark with Karen's blood. The other 2 men were strangers to her, hard-faced individuals who looked more comfortable with violence than the typical Millbrook farmer or shopkeeper. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Price," Roberts called out, his voice carrying the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Hand over the woman and ride on. This doesn't concern you." Raymond stepped into view from behind the rocks, his rifle held casually but ready. At this distance, Karen could see the controlled stillness that had settled over him, the predator's patience that marked him as something far more dangerous than the men who hunted them. "Everything about this concerns me," Raymond replied, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "An innocent woman was tortured by a mob based on the lies of a man who couldn't take no for an answer. That makes it my business." Roberts's face darkened. You don't know what you're talking about, stranger. I saw what I saw. Did you? Or did you see what you wanted to see when she refused your advances? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Karen watched Robert's expression shift, saw the flicker of guilt and rage that confirmed Raymond's suspicions. She remembered now the times Roberts had lingered too long when he came to buy eggs from her chickens, the way his eyes had followed her movements, the offers of help that had come with conditions she couldn't accept. Lies, Roberts spat, but his voice lacked conviction. One of the strangers, a lean man with a scar running from his left ear to his jawline, shifted in his saddle. We didn't come here to listen to talk, Roberts. You said there'd be money in this. Money, the word hit Karen like a physical blow. This wasn't about justice or morality or even Roberts' wounded pride. This was about profit. About whatever reward Roberts had offered these men for helping him silence the woman who could expose his lies. Raymond's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his rifle. Hired guns, Roberts? Is that what it's come to? Sometimes a man has to take matters into his own hands when the law fails, Roberts replied. That woman has caused enough trouble. It ends today. You're right about one thing, Raymond said, raising his rifle with deliberate slowness. It does end today. The scarred man went for his pistol first, his hand flashing to the weapon at his hip with practiced speed. Raymond's rifle boomed before the man's gun cleared leather, the heavy ball taking him center mass and lifting him from his saddle. He hit the ground hard and didn't move again. The remaining men scattered, their horses dancing nervously as the echo of the gunshot rolled across the hills. Michael Brooks wheeled his mount to the left, trying to flank the outcropping, while the third stranger spurred his horse directly forward, a rifle of his own coming up to his shoulder. Raymond was already moving, dropping behind cover as the stranger's shot chipped stone from the boulder beside Karen's head. She pressed herself lower, her heart hammering so hard she was sure it could be heard over the gunfire. The acrid smell of black powder filled her nostrils, mixing with the metallic taste of fear on her tongue. 2 shots, Raymond muttered, more to himself than to her. He was reloading with swift efficiency, measuring powder and ramming home a fresh ball with movements that spoke of countless repetitions. Brooks is circling left. The other one's trying to pin us down. Another shot cracked across the morning air, this one from Brooks' position. The ball whined off stones somewhere above their heads, sending chips of granite skittering down the slope. Karen caught a glimpse of movement through a gap in the rocks and saw the third man advancing on foot, using his horse for cover as he worked his way closer. Raymond finished loading and rose smoothly from cover, his rifle tracking to the left where Brooks had disappeared behind a stand of scrub pine. The mountain man's patience was absolute, waiting for the perfect moment when instinct and opportunity aligned. The moment came when Brooks broke from cover, trying to reach a better position. Raymond's rifle spoke again, and Brooks tumbled from his saddle with a cry of pain and rage. The whip fell from his hand as he clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "Brooks!" Roberts shouted, his voice cracking with something that might have been genuine concern or simple calculation of diminishing odds. The third man used the distraction to close the distance, rising from behind his horse with rifle ready. But Raymond had anticipated the move, and his own weapon was already swinging toward the new threat. The 2 shots came almost simultaneously, the reports blending into a single thunderous roar that sent birds exploding from the nearby trees. Karen saw Raymond stagger, saw the dark stain spreading across his left side, and felt her world tilt on its axis. The man who had saved her, who had stood between her and the mob's fury, was wounded, possibly dying. But the third stranger was down as well, his rifle spinning away into the grass as he fell. That left only Alexander Roberts, and Karen could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options. 2 of his hired men were dead, Brooks was wounded, and the mountain man was still standing despite taking a ball in the ribs. Raymond pressed his hand to his side, and when he pulled it away, his palm came back red, but his grip on the rifle never wavered, and his pale eyes remained fixed on Roberts with unwavering intensity. "It's over, Roberts," Raymond called out, his voice steady despite the pain that had to be coursing through him. "Your men are down. Brooks needs a doctor. Time to end this before more people die." Roberts' hand moved to the pistol at his belt, and Karen saw the madness that had taken hold of him. This wasn't about justice anymore, if it ever had been. This was about a man who couldn't accept that his lies had been exposed, who couldn't bear the thought of facing the consequences of his actions. "She has to die," Robert said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that made Karen's blood run cold. "She knows too much. She'll ruin me." "She'll ruin you?" Raymond's laugh was harsh and without humor. "You've already ruined yourself, Roberts. The only question now is whether you're fool enough to die for it." Roberts drew his pistol, and Karen saw Raymond's rifle coming up to meet the threat. But the mountain man's movements were slower now, hampered by the wound in his side, and Roberts had the advantage of being mounted and mobile. The pistol cracked, and Raymond grunted as a second ball found its mark, this one taking him high in the left shoulder and spinning him partially around. He kept his feet, but the rifle slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the rocks. Robert spurred his horse forward, sensing victory within his grasp. "Should have minded your own business, stranger. Should have let us finish what we started." Karen watched in horror as Roberts raised the pistol for a killing shot. Raymond was down on one knee now, blood streaming from two wounds, his face pale but his eyes still defiant. He reached for the long knife at his belt with his good hand, but Roberts was too far away, the range too great for a thrown blade. This was how it would end then. The man who had saved her would die because she had been too weak to save herself, too helpless to fight back against the lies and hatred that had brought them to this moment. The injustice of it burned in her chest like swallowed fire. But as Roberts's finger tightened on the trigger, a new sound cut through the morning air. Hoofbeats coming fast from the direction of town. Roberts hesitated, turning to look back toward Millbrook, and in that moment of distraction, Karen saw her chance. The rifle Raymond had dropped lay just within her reach, still loaded with the shot he hadn't been able to fire. She had watched her husband Thomas clean and load his hunting rifle countless times, had even fired it herself on occasion when predators threatened their livestock. Her hands shook as she lifted the heavy weapon, but her resolve was steady. "Roberts," she called out, her voice carrying across the space between them. The farmer turned back toward her, his eyes widening as he saw the rifle pointed at his chest. For a moment, the tableau held, predator and prey frozen in a moment of perfect balance. "You want to know what really happened that night?" Karen said, her finger finding the trigger. "I was home tending my sick cow just like I told everyone. But you couldn't let it go, could you? You couldn't accept that a widow might choose to live alone rather than submit to your advances." Roberts's face went white. "You don't understand. I can give you everything. A home, security, respectability. All I have to do is lie," Karen finished. "Pretend that your version of that night was true. Let you save face while I bear the shame. Is that it?" The hoofbeats were getting closer, and Karen could see dust rising from the road to town. Whoever was coming would arrive within minutes, and the dynamic of this confrontation would shift once again. Roberts seemed to realize this as well. His grip tightened on the pistol, and Karen saw the moment when desperation overcame calculation. He was going to shoot, regardless of the consequences, regardless of who might witness his crime. "I'm sorry," Karen whispered, though whether to Raymond, to Thomas, or to herself, she couldn't say. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with tremendous force, the recoil nearly knocking her backward. Through the cloud of white smoke that billowed from the barrel, she saw Alexander Roberts pitch sideways from his saddle, the pistol spinning away into the grass. His horse reared and bolted, leaving its rider crumpled on the ground. Karen lowered the smoking rifle, her hands trembling now that the moment had passed. She had killed a man. Whatever else happened, whatever the consequences might be, she had taken a human life to save another. The weight of that knowledge settled on her shoulders like a mantle of lead. Raymond struggled to his feet, pressing his good hand to the wound in his side. Blood seeped between his fingers. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. He looked at Karen with something that might have been pride, or gratitude, or simple recognition of what she had become in that moment of crisis. "Well done," he said simply. The approaching riders crested the hill, just as Michael Brooks groaned and tried to sit up, his wounded shoulder making the movement awkward and painful. Karen counted 5 men on horseback, led by a figure she recognized even at a distance. Robert Ross, the blacksmith who had spoken up during the confrontation in the town square, rode at the head of the group with Matthew Stewart beside him. "Looks like the cavalry's arrived," Raymond muttered, swaying slightly on his feet. The blood loss was beginning to tell on him, and Karen could see the effort it took for him to remain upright. She moved to his side, offering what support her smaller frame could provide. Up close, she could see the full extent of his injuries. The ball that had taken him in the ribs had torn through muscle and possibly nicked bone, while the shoulder wound was bleeding freely, despite his attempts to stanch the flow. "You need a doctor," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Later," Raymond replied, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "First, we see what kind of justice Millbrook really wants to dispense." Robert Ross reined in his horse 20 feet away, his weathered face grim as he took in the scene. Alexander Roberts lay motionless in the grass, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The two hired guns were clearly dead, and Michael Brooks sat hunched over his wounded shoulder, his face pale with pain and shock. "What happened here?" Ross asked, his voice carefully neutral. Raymond straightened despite his wounds, meeting the blacksmith's gaze with unflinching directness. "Roberts brought hired killers to silence the woman he falsely accused. When talk failed, they chose violence. We defended ourselves." Matthew Stewart's eyes moved from the bodies to the blood on Raymond's clothes to the rifle in Karen's hands. "You're saying Roberts lied about what he saw?" "I'm saying Roberts saw exactly what he wanted to see," Raymond replied. "What he needed to see to justify forcing himself on a woman who had already refused his advances." Brooks tried to speak, but the words came out as a pained wheeze. Ross dismounted and knelt beside the wounded man, helping him sit up straighter. "Easy, Michael. What can you tell us?" He offered us money," Brooks gasped, nodding toward Roberts' still form. "Said the woman had to be silenced. Said she knew things that could ruin him." The admission hung in the air like the scent of cordite from the recent gunfire. Karen saw the expressions on the faces of the men who had ridden out from town, saw understanding dawn in their eyes as the pieces of Robert's deception fell into place. "Dear God," Stewart whispered, "what have we done?" Helen Williams had ridden with the men, Karen realized with surprise. The older woman dismounted and hurried to Karen's side, her face etched with guilt and concern. "Child, I'm so sorry. We should have listened. We should have asked questions instead of simply accepting." "It's done," Karen said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. The scars on her back would heal, but the memory of standing bound to that post while her neighbors called for blood would remain with her forever. Ross stood and walked to where Alexander Roberts lay. He knelt and pressed his ear to the man's chest, then sat back on his heels with a heavy sigh. "He's dead." The finality of those words seemed to drain the remaining tension from the scene. Karen felt her legs begin to shake as the full weight of what had transpired settled on her. She had killed a man, ended a life, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The rifle slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering against the rocks. Raymond's good arm came around her shoulders, steadying her as much as his own wounds would allow. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. "He would have killed us both." "I know," Karen whispered, "but knowing doesn't make it easier." Helen Williams approached them both, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We owe you an apology that can never be adequate," she said to Karen. "And we owe you a debt that can never be repaid," she added, looking at Raymond. "The debt is paid," Raymond replied. "Justice was served, even if it took longer than it should have." Robert Ross was examining the bodies of the two hired gunmen, his expression growing darker by the moment. "I know these men," he said finally. "Drifters who've been through town before. The kind who will do anything for coin and ask no questions about right or wrong." Matthew Stewart helped Michael Brooks to his feet, the wounded man leaning heavily on the preacher's arm. "We need to get him back to town," Stewart said, "and we need to send word to the territorial marshal about what happened here." "What about her?" one of the other riders asked, nodding toward Karen. Ross looked at Karen for a long moment, then at Raymond, then back at the evidence of Roberts' deception scattered across the hillside. "What about her? She's an innocent woman who was nearly murdered by a mob based on the lies of a man who couldn't accept rejection. She defended herself and her protector against hired killers. I see no crime in that." Karen felt a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. The fear that had haunted her since the moment Roberts first made his accusation, the terror that she would be branded forever as an adulteress and outcast, began to fade. But as the immediate crisis passed, new concerns took its place. Raymond was badly wounded and needed medical attention. Her own back was a mess of torn flesh that would require careful tending, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that this might not be the end of their troubles. Roberts had been a prominent man in Millbrook, well-connected and influential. His death would raise questions, and not everyone would be satisfied with the answers. There would be those who would see Karen as a woman who had brought nothing but trouble and violence to their peaceful community. As if reading her thoughts, Raymond spoke quietly in her ear. This isn't over. There will be others who supported Roberts, others who profited from his influence. They won't forget what happened here. Karen nodded, understanding the implication. She could return to Millbrook, try to rebuild her life among people who had been willing to see her whipped to death based on one man's lies. Or she could choose a different path, one that led away from the familiar and into the unknown. The choice, for the first time in months, was entirely her own. The journey back to Millbrook passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Raymond rode double behind Robert Ross, his wounds making it impossible for him to manage a horse on his own. Karen found herself mounted behind Helen Williams, the older woman's steady presence a comfort after the violence of the morning. As they approached the town limits, Karen could see people gathering in the streets, drawn by the news that had preceded their return. Word traveled fast in a small community, and by now everyone would know that Alexander Roberts was dead, that the charges against her had been proven false, that blood had been spilled in the hills above town. The crowd that assembled in the town square was different from the one that had gathered to watch her punishment. Gone was the bloodthirsty excitement, replaced by a subdued mixture of shame, curiosity, and uncertainty. These people had been ready to see her die for a crime she didn't commit, and now they had to face the consequences of their collective judgment. Dr. Samuel Hayes was waiting with his medical bag, his weathered face grave as he took in Raymond's condition. "Get him to my office," he ordered, directing Ross and another man to help the wounded mountain man down from the horse. "Those wounds need immediate attention." As they carried Raymond away, Karen found herself alone in the center of the square, where hours earlier she had been bound and beaten. The wooden post still stood there, dark stains on its surface, marking where her blood had fallen. Someone had already begun to clean up the scattered rope and leather, but the evidence of what had transpired remained. Matthew Stewart approached her slowly, his face etched with lines of guilt and regret. "Mrs. Long," he began, then stopped, as if unsure how to continue. "What is it, Matthew?" Karen asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The things we did to you today." He struggled to find words adequate to the magnitude of their collective failure. "There's no excuse for what happened, no justification for the pain we caused you." Karen looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing shame and embarrassment, and the dawning realization of how close they had come to murdering an innocent woman. Part of her wanted to rage at them, to make them understand the depth of their betrayal. But another part of her, the part that had been shaped by loss and hardship and the necessity of survival, simply felt tired. "You believed what you wanted to believe," she said finally. "What was convenient to believe. Alexander Roberts was a respected man, and I was just a widow with no one to speak for me." "That doesn't make it right," Helen Williams said, stepping forward from the crowd. "We should have asked questions. We should have demanded proof. We should have remembered that you were one of us, deserving of our protection, not our condemnation." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled townspeople, but Karen could also see the faces of those who remained unconvinced. Roberts had been popular with certain segments of the community, and his death would not sit well with everyone. She could read the calculation in some eyes, the weighing of old loyalties against new revelations. Sarah Harris pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with emotion. "What about the hired men Roberts brought? What about the money he offered them to silence you? Doesn't that prove his guilt?" "It proves he was desperate," said a voice from the back of the crowd. "Desperate men do foolish things. That doesn't necessarily mean the original charges were false." Karen turned to see who had spoken and felt her heart sink. James Morton, Roberts' business partner and closest friend, stood at the edge of the square with several other men. His face was hard with grief and anger, and Karen could see that he had no intention of accepting the version of events that cleared her name. "Roberts is dead," Morton continued, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "He can't defend himself against these accusations. How convenient for those who would profit from his downfall." The crowd stirred uneasily, some nodding in agreement with Morton's words, others looking uncertain. Karen realized that Raymond had been right. Roberts's death had not ended her troubles. It had merely transformed them into something else. "James," Robert Ross said, stepping forward, "you heard Michael Brooks' confession. You know Roberts hired those men to kill an innocent woman." "I heard the confession of a wounded man who might have said anything to save his own skin," Morton replied. "And I see a woman who has brought nothing but death and violence to our community." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Karen felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, measuring her, judging her, deciding whether she was victim or villain in the day's events. The familiar fear began to creep back into her chest, the terror of being alone and defenseless against the collective will of the community. But then she remembered the feel of the rifle in her hands, the moment when she had chosen to fight rather than submit. She had killed to defend herself and the man who had saved her. That act had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "You're right about one thing, James," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I have brought violence to your community, but I didn't start it. I didn't ask to be falsely accused. I didn't ask to be tied to a post and whipped for a crime I didn't commit. I didn't ask for Alexander Roberts to bring hired killers to silence me." She paused, looking around at the faces surrounding her, seeing the mix of shame and uncertainty and lingering hostility. "But when violence came for me, I met it. When men tried to murder me and the man who defended me, I fought back. And I'll do it again if I have to." The declaration seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Karen could see the impact of her words in the faces around her, the recognition that the frightened widow they had known was gone, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. James Morton's face darkened. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," Karen replied. "I won't be anyone's victim again. Not yours, not Roberts's, not anyone's." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by the arrival of Dr. Hayes, who emerged from his office wiping blood from his hands. His expression was grim as he approached the crowd. "How is he?" Karen asked, her heart clenching with fear. "He'll live," Hayes replied. "But it was close. The ball in his ribs missed his lung by inches, and he's lost a lot of blood. He needs rest and careful tending if he's going to recover fully." Relief flooded through Karen, so intense it made her knees weak. Raymond would survive. The man who had risked everything to save her would live to see another day. "Where will he stay during his recovery?" Helen Williams asked. "My husband and I would be honored to offer him our hospitality." Before Karen could respond, James Morton spoke up again. "That man is a stranger here. We don't know anything about him except that he's quick to violence. Are we sure we want him recovering in our midst?" The suggestion that Raymond was somehow a threat to the community was so absurd that Karen almost laughed. But she could see that Morton's words were having an effect on some of the townspeople, feeding their uncertainty and fear. "He saved an innocent woman from being murdered," Robert Ross said firmly. "That's all I need to know about his character." "He killed 3 men today," Morton countered. 3 members of our community. 3 men who were trying to commit murder," Ross shot back. "Would you rather he had let them succeed?" The argument continued, voices rising as the crowd began to take sides. Karen watched the division forming in her community, the lines being drawn between those who accepted the truth of what had happened and those who preferred Roberts's version of events. She realized that her presence in Millbrook would always be a source of conflict, a reminder of the town's collective failure and the violence that had resulted from it. The decision, when it came to her, felt inevitable. "I'll be leaving Millbrook," Karen announced, her voice cutting through the heated argument like a blade through silk. The sudden silence that followed was so complete, she could hear the wind stirring the fallen leaves at her feet. James Morton's face registered surprise, then something that might have been satisfaction. "Running away, are you? That seems about right for someone who brings nothing but trouble." Karen met his gaze without flinching. I'm not running from anything, James. I'm choosing to build a life somewhere I won't be reminded daily of how quickly neighbors can become executioners. The words hit their mark. She saw several faces in the crowd flush with shame, saw others look away rather than meet her eyes. Helen Williams stepped forward, her expression stricken. Karen, please, don't let the actions of a few drive you away from your home. There are many of us who stood by and watched while I was whipped bloody for a crime I didn't commit. Karen's voice remained calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Who cheered for more lashes while my back was torn open? I appreciate your kindness, Helen, truly I do, but this place stopped being my home the moment that crowd gathered around the whipping post. Robert Ross cleared his throat, his weathered face troubled. Where will you go? You have no family, no connections outside Millbrook. Karen looked toward Dr. Hayes' office, where Raymond Price lay recovering from wounds he'd taken defending her. The man who had walked into their town like something from a legend, who had faced down 30 people to save a woman he'd never met. The man who had shown her that sometimes strength came not from enduring suffering, but from refusing to accept it. I'll figure that out, she said simply. The crowd began to disperse, the drama of the morning finally drawing to a close. Some left with obvious relief, eager to return to their normal lives and forget the uncomfortable questions the day had raised. Others lingered, perhaps hoping for some final resolution that would make sense of the violence and revelation that had shattered their community's peace. Karen walked to Dr. Hayes' office, ignoring the whispers that followed in her wake. The building was small and cramped, smelling of carbolic acid and the herbs Hayes used in his treatments. She found the doctor washing instruments in a basin of hot water, his movements methodical and precise. How is he? She asked. Hayes looked up, his eyes kind but weary. Stable. The fever broke an hour ago, which is a good sign, but he'll need several weeks to recover fully. And that's assuming no complications set in. May I see him? Hayes nodded toward a door at the back of the room. He's been asking for you. Karen found Raymond propped up in a narrow bed, his chest wrapped in clean bandages. The pallor of blood loss had faded somewhat, replaced by the healthier color of a man on the mend. His pale eyes tracked to her face as she entered, and she saw a relief flicker across his features. You look better than I expected, she said, settling into the chair beside his bed. Takes more than a couple of bullet holes to put me down, Raymond replied, though his voice was rough with exhaustion. I heard shouting outside. Morton giving you trouble? Karen nodded. He's not ready to accept that his friend was a liar and a would-be murderer. There are others who feel the same way. My presence here will always be a source of division. Raymond studied her face with those unsettling eyes of his. So what will you do? Leave? Start over somewhere else. Somewhere I won't have to see the faces of people who were ready to watch me die. That's a hard choice. This is your home. Karen shook her head. Home is supposed to be a place of safety, of belonging. This stopped me being that the moment Alexander Roberts pointed his finger at me and the town believed his lies without question. Raymond was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I have a cabin up in the mountains, about 3 days' ride north of here, in a valley where the hunting is good and the nearest neighbor is 50 miles away. It's not much, but it's peaceful. A person could build a life there if they had the strength for it. Karen felt her heart skip. Are you offering me sanctuary? I'm offering you a choice. You could come with me when I'm well enough to travel. Help me work the land, share the burden of survival. It wouldn't be easy. Mountain winters are harsh, and the isolation can drive some people mad. But you'd be free. Free from judgment. Free from the past. Free to become whoever you choose to be. The offer hung between them like a bridge spanning a chasm. Karen could see the life he was describing, could imagine herself in that remote valley, building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. But she could also see the risks, the dangers of placing her trust in a man she barely knew, no matter how much she owed him. Why, she asked. Why would you make such an offer to a stranger? Raymond's eyes found hers again, and she saw something in their depths that made her breath catch. Not pity, not obligation, but something deeper and more complex. Because I recognize something in you, he said quietly. The same thing I saw in myself years ago when I first headed into the mountains. The need to leave behind a world that had no place for who you really are. The courage to face the unknown rather than accept an unacceptable present. Karen felt tears prick her eyes. Though whether from gratitude or grief, or simple exhaustion, she couldn't say. I don't know if I have that kind of courage. You killed a man to defend yourself and someone you cared about. You stood up to a mob that wanted to see you destroyed. You've already shown more courage than most people possess in a lifetime. The words settled into her chest like warmth from a fire, chasing away some of the cold that had taken root there during the long months of Thomas's illness and death, during the nightmare of Robert's accusations and the town's betrayal. I need time to think, she said finally. Raymond nodded. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere for a while. Karen spent the next 3 days in a strange limbo, staying at Helen Williams' house while she considered her options. The older woman was kindness itself, fussing over Karen's healing wounds and trying to make up for the town's collective failure through sheer force of hospitality. But even Helen's warmth couldn't erase the hostile stares Karen received when she ventured into town, or the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. James Morton had been busy during those 3 days, gathering support among those who had been closest to Alexander Roberts. He painted a picture of Karen as a manipulative woman who had somehow orchestrated Robert's death to cover her own sins, who had seduced the mountain man into defending her through feminine wiles and false tears. It was a narrative that appealed to those who couldn't face the possibility that they had nearly murdered an innocent woman. The division in Millbrook was growing deeper by the day. Families were split between those who accepted the truth of what had happened and those who preferred Morton's version of events. Friendships that had lasted decades were strained to the breaking point. The violence that had erupted in the hills above town was spreading through the community like poison in a well. On the third evening, as Karen sat by Helen's fireplace mending one of her few remaining dresses, a knock came at the door. Helen answered it to find Sarah Harris standing on the doorstep, her face pale with worry. "Sarah, what brings you out so late?" Helen asked, ushering the younger woman inside. Sarah's eyes found Karen immediately. "I had to warn you, Morton's been talking to some of the men, the ones who were closest to Roberts. They're saying you can't be allowed to stay in Millbrook, that your presence is tearing the community apart." Karen set down her mending, her stomach clenching with familiar fear. What exactly are they planning? I don't know for certain, but my husband overheard Morton talking to 3 other men about making sure you understood you weren't welcome here. They mentioned something about visiting you tonight, about making their position clear. The threat was obvious, even couched in euphemism. Karen had seen what happened when groups of men decided to make their position clear to women who had crossed them. The memory of the whipping post was still fresh in her mind, the feel of leather biting into her back, the taste of blood on her lips. "How many men?" Helen asked, her voice tight with concern. "At least 4, maybe more. They've been drinking at Morton's house since afternoon, working themselves up to it." Karen stood, her decision crystallizing in that moment of crisis. She had faced this choice before, in the town square when the crowd called for her blood. She could submit, could try to appease the anger directed at her, could hope that showing proper remorse and humility might earn her a place in this community that had already rejected her. Or she could fight. "I need to get to Dr. Hayes' office," she said, moving toward the door. Helen caught her arm. "Karen, what are you thinking? If Morton and his friends are planning trouble, the last thing you should do is go out alone." "I'm not going to wait here like a lamb for slaughter," Karen replied, gently but firmly removing Helen's hand. "And I won't let Raymond face whatever's coming while he's still recovering from his wounds." Sarah Harris stepped forward. "I'll come with you. Safety in numbers." "No." Karen's voice was firm. "You've done enough by warning me. I won't have you caught up in whatever happens next." She slipped out into the night before either woman could protest further. The streets of Millbrook were dark and quiet. Most of the town's residents safe in their homes, unaware of the storm that was building. Karen moved through the shadows like a ghost, keeping to the alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Morton's men might be watching. Dr. Hayes' office was dark when she reached it, but a thin line of light showed beneath the door to the back room where Raymond was recovering. Karen tried the front door and found it unlocked, a testament to the trust that had once existed in this small community before violence and suspicion had poisoned it. She made her way through the outer office by field so, navigating around the furniture and medical equipment until she reached the door to Raymond's room. She knocked softly, then entered without waiting for a response. Raymond was sitting up in bed, fully dressed despite his wounds. His rifle lay across his lap, and his pale eyes were alert and watchful. He looked up as she entered, unsurprised by her appearance. "Trouble coming?" he asked. "Morton and some others. They want to make sure I understand I'm not welcome in Millbrook." Raymond nodded grimly. "I figured as much. Hayes mentioned seeing men gathering at Morton's place when he went to check on Michael Brooks earlier." "You're in no condition to fight," Karen said, though she could see from his posture and the steadiness of his hands that he was stronger than she'd expected. "I'm in better condition than I was 3 days ago. And I've fought in worse shape than this." He gestured toward the chair where his gun belt hung. "Hand me that, would you?" Karen retrieved the belt, noting the weight of the pistol and the long knife that hung from it. As Raymond strapped it around his waist, she found herself studying his face, memorizing the strong lines of his jaw, the network of scars that spoke of a life lived on the edge of danger. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "You've already done more than enough for me. If you slip out the back way now, you could be miles away before they even know you're gone." Raymond looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "And leave you to face them alone? That's not going to happen." "Why?" The question burst out of her with more force than she'd intended. "Why do you keep risking yourself for me? I'm nobody special, just a widow with more troubles than sense." Raymond was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "My wife was killed by men like Morton and Roberts, men who decided she was a threat to their version of how the world should work. I wasn't there to protect her, wasn't even in the territory when it happened. I came home to find her grave in a town full of people who looked away when I asked questions." The revelation hit Karen like a physical blow. She had wondered about the shadows she sometimes glimpsed in Raymond's eyes, the sense of old pain carefully controlled. Now she understood. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was a long time ago. But when I walked into that town square and saw you tied to that post, saw the blood on your back and the hatred in their faces." He shook his head. "I couldn't let it happen again. Not when I had the power to stop it." The sound of voices outside cut through the moment of shared understanding. Raymond rose from the bed with careful movements, testing his strength. Karen could see the pain in his face, but also the determination that had carried him through years of survival in unforgiving country. "How many do you think?" she asked. "4 or 5 from the sound of it. They're trying to be quiet, but they've been drinking, and they're not as stealthy as they think they are." Karen moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. She could see shapes moving in the darkness, men positioning themselves around the building. Morton's voice carried clearly in the still air, though she couldn't make out the words. "They're surrounding the place," she reported. Raymond nodded, unsurprised. "Standard tactics for men who don't want their target to escape. They'll try to flush us out, probably with threats first, then escalate if we don't cooperate." As if summoned by his words, Morton's voice rose from the street outside. "Price, we know you're in there, and we know the woman is with you. Come out and we can settle this like civilized men." Raymond moved to the window beside Karen, his rifle ready. "What's your definition of civilized, Morton?" "The woman leaves Millbrook tonight. She takes nothing but the clothes on her back and she never comes back. That's the only way this ends without more bloodshed. And if she refuses?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Karen felt the familiar chill of fear, but underneath it was something new. Something that had been growing stronger since the moment she pulled the trigger on Alexander Roberts. Anger. Not the helpless rage of a victim, but the cold fury of someone who had been pushed too far. "I'm tired of running," she said quietly, more to herself than to Raymond. He glanced at her, seeing something in her face that made him nod with approval. "Then we make our stand here." The first shot came without further warning, shattering the window beside Karen's head and sending glass cascading to the floor. She dropped to her knees instinctively, her heart hammering as the sound of the gunshot echoed through the night. Raymond was already moving, rolling away from the window and finding cover behind the heavy wooden desk that dominated the room. "So much for civilized conversation," he muttered, checking his rifle's priming. More shots followed, the muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness outside like deadly fireflies. The men surrounding the building were shooting blind, hoping to terrorize their targets into submission rather than aiming with any precision. Bullets thudded into the wooden walls and shattered the remaining windows, filling the air with splinters and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Karen crawled across the floor to where Raymond crouched behind the desk, her mind racing as she tried to process the reality of her situation. 3 days ago, she had been a grieving widow trying to rebuild her life. Now she was trapped in a gunfight with men who wanted to see her dead or driven away in disgrace. "How many shots do you have?" she asked, having to raise her voice over the sound of gunfire. "Enough," Raymond replied, though she noticed he was carefully rationing his ammunition, waiting for clear targets rather than returning fire blindly. "The question is how long they're willing to keep this up. Morton's not a soldier. Neither are his friends. This kind of sustained fighting isn't something they're used to." A voice called out from the darkness, different from Morton's. "Price, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Send the woman out, and we'll let you ride away." Raymond's response was a carefully aimed shot that sparked off metal somewhere in the street, followed by a curse and the sound of scrambling feet. "I don't negotiate with cowards who hide in the dark." The return volley was immediate and intense, a dozen shots that turned the air inside the office into a storm of flying wood and glass. Karen pressed herself flat against the floor, feeling splinters rain down on her back. When the shooting stopped, the silence seemed almost as loud as the gunfire had been. "They're going to try to get closer," Raymond said, his voice calm despite their desperate situation. "Morton's smart enough to know he can't win a long-range fight against someone who actually knows how to shoot." As if to confirm his prediction, Karen heard the sound of footsteps moving carefully around the building. The attackers were repositioning, trying to find better angles or perhaps planning to rush the building directly. "There's a back door," she whispered. "We could try to slip out." Raymond shook his head. "They'll have it covered. Our best chance is to make them pay such a high price for this fight that they decide it's not worth it." A new sound reached them from outside, the crackle of flames. Karen smelled smoke and felt her stomach drop as she realized what Morton's men were planning. "They're trying to burn us out," she said. Raymond's face was grim in the flickering light that was beginning to seep through the broken windows. Desperate men do desperate things, but fire works both ways. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small cloth bag that Karen recognized as black powder. Working quickly despite his wounds, he began preparing something that looked like a crude bomb, wrapping the powder in cloth and adding pieces of metal from Dr. Hayes's instrument tray. "When I throw this, they'll scatter," he explained. "That's our chance to break out. Stay close to me and keep your head down." The smell of smoke was getting stronger, and Karen could see the orange glow of flames beginning to lick at the walls. The building was old and dry, and it would go up quickly once the fire really took hold. They had minutes at most before their shelter became their tomb. Raymond moved to the shattered window and peered out, looking for the best target for his improvised weapon. Karen saw him tense, then draw back quickly as a shot rang out, the bullet passing through the space where his head had been moments before. "They're getting bolder," he muttered. "Time to remind them why that's a mistake." He pulled the fuse on his makeshift bomb and hurled it through the window. The explosion that followed was tremendous, lighting up the night and sending men scrambling for cover. In the chaos that followed, Raymond grabbed Karen's hand and pulled her toward the back door. They burst out into the night air, the cool darkness a relief after the smoke-filled confines of the burning building. But their escape had been anticipated. Two men waited in the alley behind the office, their weapons trained on the door. Raymond's pistol was in his hand before Karen even saw him draw it, the weapon speaking twice in rapid succession. One of the waiting men spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. The other dove for cover behind a pile of lumber, his shot going wild. "This way," Raymond said, pulling Karen toward the far end of the alley. They ran through the maze of Millbrook's back streets, the burning building behind them casting dancing shadows on the walls around them. Karen could hear shouts and running footsteps as Morton's men tried to regroup and pursue, but the explosion had scattered them, and the darkness worked in the fugitive's favor. Raymond led her to the stable where the horses were kept, his movements sure despite the unfamiliar territory. He had scouted escape routes, Karen realized. Even while recovering from his wounds, he had been planning for this possibility. "Can you ride?" he asked, saddling two horses with quick efficiency. "Well enough," Karen replied, though her experience was limited to the gentle farm horses Thomas had kept for plowing. Raymond helped her mount, then swung into his own saddle with a grimace of pain. The wounds in his side and shoulder were clearly bothering him, but he showed no sign of letting them slow him down. They rode out of Millbrook at a gallop, the burning building behind them lighting up the night sky like a beacon. Karen didn't look back. Whatever life she might have rebuilt in this town was gone now, consumed by flames and violence and the hatred of men who couldn't accept that they had been wrong. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and forbidding, but also promising sanctuary for those brave enough to seek it. Karen thought of Raymond's offer, of the cabin in the remote valley where a person could build a new life free from judgment and the weight of the past. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was growing fainter. Morton and his men were on foot, and their horses were already tired from the chase through town. By the time they could organize a proper pursuit, Karen and Raymond would be miles away, lost in the wilderness that was Raymond's natural element. "Where are we going?" Karen asked as they rode through the night. "North," Raymond replied, "to the high country where the air is clean and the only law is what a person makes for themselves." Karen nodded, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not the desperate hope of a victim praying for rescue, but the confident hope of someone who had chosen their own path and was prepared to walk it regardless of the obstacles ahead. The mountains welcomed them into their embrace, and Karen Long rode toward her new life with the mountain man who had shown her that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in enduring suffering, but in refusing to accept it. 3 weeks later, Karen stood in the doorway of Raymond's cabin, watching the sun rise over the valley that would be her new home. The structure was larger than she had expected, built from logs that Raymond had cut and shaped himself during the long winters of his solitude. It was simple but solid, designed to withstand the harsh mountain weather and provide shelter for someone who valued function over decoration. The valley itself was everything Raymond had promised and more. A clear stream ran through its center, fed by snowmelt from the peaks that surrounded them on all sides. Pine and aspen covered the slopes, their branches heavy with the promise of winter. Game trails crisscrossed the meadows, and Karen had already seen deer, elk, and even a black bear drinking from the stream in the early morning hours. It was beautiful, but it was also isolated in a way that took some getting used to. The nearest neighbor was indeed 50 miles away, and the silence could be overwhelming after a lifetime spent in the company of others. But Karen was discovering that solitude was different from loneliness, and that the peace of this place was healing wounds she hadn't even realized she carried. Raymond emerged from the barn where he had been tending to the horses, his movements still careful but much stronger than they had been during their flight from Millbrook. The mountain air and familiar surroundings had worked their healing magic, and the color had returned to his face. "How are you settling in?" he asked, joining her in the doorway. "Better than I expected," Karen replied honestly. "I thought I would miss the company of other people more than I do." Raymond nodded, understanding in his eyes. It takes time to appreciate the quiet, but once you do, the noise of towns and crowds becomes almost unbearable. They had fallen into an easy routine over the past weeks, sharing the work of survival that mountain living demanded. Karen had proven surprisingly adept at the practical skills their isolation required. She could shoot well enough to bring down small game, could preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter ahead, could mend clothing and gear with neat, efficient stitches. More importantly, she had proven herself to be a capable partner in the truest sense of the word. She didn't expect to be taken care of, didn't wait for Raymond to solve every problem or make every decision. She pulled her own weight and then some, contributing to their shared survival with intelligence and determination. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Karen said, her gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "About what kind of life we're building here." Raymond waited for her to continue, patient as always. It was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him, his ability to listen without judgment, to let her work through her thoughts at her own pace. In Millbrook, I was always Thomas's wife, or the widow Long, or the woman who brought trouble to town. I was defined by my relationships to other people, by their expectations and judgments. Here, I can be just myself. And who is that? Raymond asked quietly. Karen considered the question, surprised to realize she didn't have a ready answer. For so long, her identity had been shaped by external forces that she had never really stopped to consider who she might be if given the freedom to choose. I'm still figuring that out, she admitted. But I know I'm stronger than I thought I was, braver, more capable of standing up for myself and the people I care about. The last words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them had spoken aloud. Over the weeks they had spent together, something had grown between them that went beyond gratitude or convenience. It was a connection built on shared hardship and mutual respect, on the recognition of kindred spirits who had both been shaped by loss and the need to start over. Karen, Raymond said, his voice unusually hesitant, I need you to know that you're free to leave whenever you want. I brought you here to give you choices, not to trap you in a different kind of cage. She turned to face him fully, seeing the uncertainty in his pale eyes. This man who had faced down mobs and gunfighters without flinching was nervous about a conversation with her. The realization was both touching and amusing. Do you want me to leave? She asked. No. The answer came without hesitation. But what I want doesn't matter if you're not happy here. Karen reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life in the wilderness. I'm happier here than I've been in years. Happier than I thought I could be again after Thomas died. She saw relief flicker across Raymond's features, followed by something deeper and more complex. He squeezed her hand gently, his thumb tracing over her knuckles in a gesture that was both tender and possessive. I want to build something with you, she continued, not just a shelter or a way to survive, but a real life, a partnership, a future. Raymond's other hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle despite the strength in his fingers. Are you sure? This is a hard life, Karen. Lonely and dangerous and uncertain. There are no guarantees in the mountains. There are no guarantees anywhere, Karen replied. I learned that when Thomas died, when Roberts made his accusations, when the town turned against me. At least here, the dangers are honest ones. Wild animals and harsh weather don't lie or betray or judge. Raymond leaned down and kissed her then, a soft meeting of lips that tasted of coffee and the clean mountain air. It was their first kiss, but it felt like a homecoming, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. When they broke apart, Karen saw her own feelings reflected in Raymond's eyes. Love, yes, but also partnership and respect in the quiet confidence of two people who had found their place in the world. We'll need to prepare for winter, Raymond said practically, though his arms remained around her. It comes early in the high country and it's harsh. We'll need more firewood, more preserved food, warmer clothing. Karen smiled at the easy way he included her in his plans, the assumption that they would face whatever came together. Then we better get to work. They spent the rest of the morning working side by side, cutting wood and checking their supplies, planning for the months of isolation that lay ahead. But the work felt different now, infused with purpose and shared commitment. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building a life. As the sun reached its zenith, Karen paused in her work to look around the valley that had become her sanctuary. The mountains stood guard around them, ancient and unchanging, offering protection to those who understood their ways. The stream sang its endless song, and the wind whispered secrets through the pines. This was home now, not the place where she had been born or the town where she had been married, but this remote valley where she had found herself and the man who had helped her discover her own strength. It was a hard place, as Raymond had warned, but it was also honest and clean and free from the petty cruelties of civilization. Karen Long had been whipped in the town square of Millbrook, had been judged and condemned by people who should have protected her. But that woman was gone now, transformed by fire and pain and the choice to fight rather than submit. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned that true freedom came not from the absence of danger, but from the courage to face it on her own terms. The mountains had claimed her, and she had claimed them in return. Whatever the future might bring, she would meet it with Raymond Price at her side. Two souls who had found in each other the strength to build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The wind carried the scent of snow from the high peaks, a reminder that winter was coming and that the time of preparation was growing short. But Karen felt no fear at the prospect of the long, cold months ahead. She had survived worse than mountain winters, and she had learned that with the right partner, even the harshest trials could be endured. She looked at Raymond, saw him watching her with those pale eyes that had first seemed so unsettling and now seemed like home, and knew that she had made the right choice, the only choice that mattered. Together, they would face whatever came next.